right, welcome back, everybody. This is the Spectrum Cast. Last year, we called it the Modern Data Protection Spectrum Cast, but this year we're going to move it to the Data Resilience Spectrum Cast. I'm pleased to have everybody back and from the holidays. So thanks everybody for rejoining. We've got Randy Arsenault, our co-host, and we have Trisha Jang and Sean Sperry. Let's just take a quick, brief second and introduce yourselves again. Sean?
Well, my name is Sean Sperry, and I work for IBM, obviously, and I do Spectrum Protect Plus, and all sorts of modern data. Well, I guess it's not modern data protection.
Yeah.
Data resiliency. Data resilience application. Data resiliency.
There we go.
Applications.
Trisha?
Hi, Trisha Jong, based out of Silicon Valley, also with IBM, and I work as a technical evangelist also for the data resiliency portfolio.
Very good. Randy?
And Randy Arsenault, kind of co-host. Steve and I do a lot of these kind of things together. We're both in the Boston area or New England, kind of broadly speaking, and excited to be bringing this into a new year, rebranding, adding some interesting new things as we go. So thanks everybody for watching and joining and keeping it relevant and giving us your feedback.
Thanks, Randy. And as everybody knows, just to recap, the Spectrum Cast here is definitely meant to be shared among our client base, our installed customers, great for our seller community, our business partner community. You can find us on LinkedIn. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us kind of in all the social media platforms. So we hope you enjoy the show. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about this evolution, as I mentioned, from modern data protection, the kind of topics we've been talking about throughout the last couple of years, over to data resilience. So IBM had traditionally been talking about modern data protection and cyber resiliency. And at the end of the day, especially in a lot of the topics that we talked about last year, you know, whether it be cyber resiliency, disaster recovery, at the end of the day, it's about making sure your data is resilient to enable all of your business practices, right? So, you know, I think everybody knows what data is, right? It's the lifeblood of business, driving your business. And I think most everybody knows what resilience is, right? The ability to kind of build back up in the event that something happens or you lose your data or that sort of thing. And data resiliency is about the same thing. It's about the ability to kind of rebuild your environment, your data environment in the event that something happens. So Sean, can you give us your take on data resilience?
Well, I mean, I think it's just an extension of what we've been seeing in the industry for quite a while, which is cyber resilience, right? With the onslaught of these attacks that we've been having on systems and data loss as a result of them, cyber resiliency just means the ability to get your services back up and running in a timely fashion. And I kind of see data resiliency as just an extension of that, right? The ability to get your data back in the event of a loss, right?
But that begs my question when I hear data resiliency versus data protection. What's the difference?
So I again, outsider view here, as a non sort of super domain expert on data protection and resilience like you guys are, but I view it as kind of, in my mind, resilience means resistance to damage or resistance to threats in some way. So cyber resiliency, I think, is people are pretty familiar with now and pretty comfortable with the concept of designing an environment that's hard to penetrate by, you know, bad actors, right? I kind of think data resiliency is an extension of that metaphor, but deeper into the infrastructure. So now, not only are you building a perimeter around your infrastructure or your IP to prevent intrusion, but you're also architecting your systems and the data and fuel of those systems to be also resistant to threats and bad actors and changes and disruption. But I think data protection, i.e. the ability to, you know, isolate it and save it and archive it in a way that you can get it back quickly if it does get disrupted. To me, that's kind of the resilience story taken down to the level of the data. So it's almost like we're integrating the stack all the way from, you know, preventing intrusion and attacks from the outside, and also protecting ourselves from the inside so that we've got that full coverage. I mean, that's kind of how I think about it. That's probably very kind of circumspect, but that's kind of how I view it.
I would agree with you, Randy. And I like, if you think about how over the course of the last year, we talked a lot about the ability to architect your environment to be able to recover your data better, stronger, faster. We had a lot of topics about data growth and how to architect for better recovery because you have so much data. We talked about disaster recovery and how to architect to be able to get the right pieces of the most important data back as quickly as possible. I look at, and you also mentioned, right, this whole notion around architecture. And I think the biggest thing that you can think about when we think about data resilience is, where do you start? Or how do you start to think about this? And I think you think about it at an architecture level, and I always think about it as four things. So Tricia, I'd be happy to get kind of your thought process on this. But the four things I think about are, first of all, classifying your data. Second thing is understanding your data lifecycle. The third thing would be about designing that life cycle of data and the data that you have for recovery. And the fourth thing, and we always say, it's not a plan if you don't practice that plan, and putting those things in place to have what we would consider a resilient architecture, the ability to recover. Would you agree?
I agree. And I really like that concept of looking at the data from the type of data it is right up front. So classification piece, and I don't think we talk enough about that when we talk about designing the solutions and sizing the solutions, and taking the time to really understand what is my data that's out there, and what type of recovery do I need? What kind of resilience do I need for that specific types of data?
It's funny, so many of these concepts to me always harken back to the, halcyon days of ILM, right? It's all basically extensions of ILM concepts and practices. Data has a certain temporal value, it has a monetary value, it has relevance for a certain period of time. And during that period of time, you want to make sure that you're serving it and delivering it in the most efficient and, high performance and reliable way. And then at some point, as it ages out of that phase, it can be stored in a not less reliable, but lower cost and lower performance mode. So it's like that concept just never dies.
And Sean, as you're talking to clients, do you think a lot of them are thinking about architecting for recovery, or just architecting their backup solution to make sure that their data gets backed up?
Oh, I think a lot of them think about backup as opposed to recovery, right? And I think a lot of what it comes down to is, a lot of people think about what I think about when I hear this, and that's the cost, right? Meaning we're talking about adding a cost to business, which doesn't necessarily have a direct point of recovery in terms of sales, right? And that's why this data classification that you have at the top of the slide is very important, right? Determine data value by reference, right? The value of the data. How much is this worth? And what am I going to do to protect it? And what am I willing to pay to protect it and to be able to recover it in a timely fashion? And that answer is going to be different depending on how you classify the data and classify the service, right?
And I think that's also, you express a concern about cost, but if you classify correctly, then you will reduce that cost because you're not sending everything over to be replicated. You're not sending everything to the most expensive disk. Yep. You're not keeping everything forever.
Well, and that kind of optimization, I believe, or I presume, becomes even more important as the volumes of data that clients are dealing with. Of course, breaking news, data volume is increasing. Clients are dealing with more data all the time. So that becomes even more important because obviously, by extension, the amount of data that's relevant at any point in time is also increasing. So if it's super, super expensive or unreasonably expensive to protect that data and make it resilient, and you can't sustain that cost structure, then your choices are either skimp on that or reduce the amount of data that you're going to keep in that, protected state, which reduces your ability to conduct your business and make the best decisions. So that's a really important aspect of it, I think.
And when I look at our portfolio, like with Spectrum Protect, I see that we've already been implementing features that help with this type of, once you understand which data has different needs, for instance, tiering. And tiering is so much more sophisticated than our old migration, because you can really specify which nodes, which file spaces are being sent out to the cloud, out to tape, or wherever along the way. And so the tools are there, and we're adding more and more tools to this. It's just up to the end user administrators to implement.
Yeah, one of the coolest demos I saw last year, and Steve, I don't remember who was on with you doing it. It might have been Joe. Anyway, it was Protect with Discover, and using Discover as the metadata engine or the curation and discovery vehicle on top of Protect. It was really cool because it was a great integrated solution that gets exactly to the point you're describing, Tricia. It was really, really very interesting.
I think as data continues to grow, having the understanding and that declassification piece becomes so much more important. So the value of tools like Spectrum Discover become more and more important as data continues to grow. The reality here is that the more I understand data, and it's harder to do it these days yourself, right? It's harder to have one person understand all the different data types that come into your environment. But if you have a tool that can help you understand that value, and then turn that, and then better classify that data, such that you can actually make sure that the most important data that drives the revenue of the business can be resilient enough and recovered as quickly as possible, so that the business can be off and running and making money again, such that you can turn around and continue to recover the rest of the business. That's what resilience is really all about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed.
Well, I was just on a call yesterday with Gartner, and we were talking about price. Sean, you brought up price, where for a lot of us who like to believe in, who are technologists that like to believe in, technology is really the coolest thing that we do and that sort of thing. Gartner was talking about the number one reason why people switch from product to product to product is really around price. Number two was capability, right? So I do think there is a close balance between price and capability from a recoverability standpoint or a data availability standpoint. So Sean, that kind of aligns with what you were talking about, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, price and capability are certainly related, right? I mean, I'm willing to pay a certain price for certain capabilities, and something that's more capable to meet the need that I have, I might be more willing to pay a higher price for that, yeah. Right?
Right.
But understanding the needs, which gets back to your data classification, is critical to that determination, right? Buying capabilities which don't help me meet my needs is not a good idea, yeah. Right? It's totally useless.
Yeah, it always comes back to that balancing act, right? You want to make sure that you're investing adequately to protect your most important data that has the most, inherent value now, and that you're then as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible archiving it to a, lower cost tier of storage when it no longer has that kind of temporal urgency.
Tricia, you were going to say?
Taking into cost and functionality, it all goes back to you've got to be able to recover it. And that goes back to your fifth point about talking to practicing what you're doing and making sure that in the end, the policies and the categorizations you've set up actually work.
Okay, what I'd like to do now is introduce a topic, current data events. And so over the course of the last few weeks, we've seen some things that impact data in ways that we might not really understand. One of those happens to be the deplatforming of Parler. Now, while that in and of itself has its own kind of rules and regulations and legalese around the Second Amendment, that's really not what's important from a data aspect that we want to chat about. So Randy, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean,
Sure.
I was just, Brandy, before you start, maybe for our international audience, you kind of ought to
Yeah.
explain what happened here in the United States with our election, because people might be
Yeah.
familiar with the election, but
Right.
not be familiar with the details of
Just in
what's
case
going on
anyone
here.
hasn't been watching the news for the last 3 months, 24 hours a day, like I have. So as I think most people know, we had an election that took place in November, after which there was a period of, let's charitably say, uncertainty and disruption and confusion and some things happening. One of the things that happened during that time frame, or actually it preceded that, but there was a new social media platform came on the scene called Parler, and Parler's stated goal was to be a platform for complete freedom of speech and First Amendment freedoms, and everybody could join and sort of freely express their views about whatever, without fear of censorship or any kind of the common terms of service limitations that platforms apply. So it became fairly popular among a portion of the population that was disputing the results of the election. Let's put it that way. Again, I'm trying to be charitable here. So without going into too much of the political ramifications of all this, a couple of interesting things happened. There was kind of a sequence of events where, first of all, a lot of people on the platform began to use it as a way to plan for activities which were, disruptive, dangerous, and frankly illegal. So as a result of that, I think I locked up there for a second. As a result of that, the app stores, the device app stores, specifically Apple and Android, dropped the application because they said it violated their terms of service. Shortly thereafter, AWS, Amazon Web Services, which was the hosting platform for Parler, also jumped in and deplatformed them. So they were kind of left without a way to connect to their end users and also without a way to support their service. The next thing that happened, which was, probably somewhat predictable, maybe if you kind of pay attention to this stuff, is that there was a breach. There was a hacker, a so-called ethical hacker who happened to be a really smart 25-year-old girl who lives in Vienna, who figured out a way to get access to all of the content that had thus far about 70 terabytes worth of data that had been stored on Parler. And it included everything, all communication. It included videos. It included all the assets that the folks on the platform were sharing amongst themselves, including timestamps and location data. Now, that became very relevant because in the events of January 6th, which were, again, pretty well publicized around the world, this data became a valuable tool for law enforcement officials and first responders to be able to identify people who were there, when they were there, and where they were. Now, this creates a whole realm of ethical questions and moral questions, and we're not going to touch on those so much, but what's interesting about it is that there was a huge gap in the security design of the platform, of the Parler platform, and also of AWS's hosting service that Parler was consuming, that allowed this hacker to pretty easily get access to all that information. Now, to her credit, she has done a very good job of kind of making it public and describing why she did it. It was arguably publicly available data. It didn't require any deep security hacks or any kind of, unethical practices. It was available. If you knew how to find it, and a lot of people did, it was available. So again, putting aside the kind of ethical and moral and political consequences of this action, what was really interesting about it, I think, is that when we think about designing for data resilience and designing for resilient infrastructure, which we talk a lot about on this podcast, they arguably did a pretty good job of isolation. The performance by all accounts was pretty good. Immutability was maybe a little too good because they had all the data out there in an immutable form, which was readily accessible by everyone. And security just was not part of their principal design, practice and design methodology. So I think it's an interesting, and we'll talk about it. I'll stop droning on, but I think it's just an interesting example of where data sovereignty, data security, data resilience can be levied or applied in both positive and negative ways. So I just thought this was a really interesting sequence of events, you know, that happened at a time when there was so much other stuff going on in the world, but it really highlights in fairly stark contrast, I think, how to design a good, resilient platform and infrastructure versus maybe how not to. So that's, you know, this month or these last couple months in the news, I guess.
Well, the interesting thing to me is this whole situation kind of goes against your preconception, or my preconception, of what a cloud provider does. And I don't want to say preconception, but it's kind of like the whole justification of going with an AWS is, quote, it's secure, right? I don't have to
Right.
worry about security anymore because they are taking care of that for me. And data security, right? I don't have to worry about protecting my data anymore because it's being hosted by AWS and they take care of all of that for me.
Right.
And I think both of those in these cases proved not to be the case for Parler, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they literally, when AWS pulled the plug on them, they had to institute their disaster recovery plan to get their service back, right? And it wasn't because of a loss, right? It's just because AWS decided to pull the plug, right?
To deplatform them. Yep.
To deplatform you, right?
Well, yeah, I think you're right, Sean, and that was my thought as well. Is it uncovers or exposes a lot of the assumptions that we make whenever we, you know, so let's say I'm a provider of some kind of a community platform of some sort that's hosted on some cloud service or external public service. You know, I have two levels of responsibility. I have responsibility to my users, to my consumers, my customers. I also have responsibility upstream with my provider to ensure that they are supporting my deliverables to my end users. And really, again, I think Parler in this example really failed on both to some extent and created this massive breach and this massive, you know, disruption that, you know, has pretty severe consequences to the people that are involved. You know, it's not only is it providing a lot of legal issues for end users, it's also exposing Parler to a lot of liability, right? So it's a, you know, it's a cautionary tale, I think, that you know, may or may not apply broadly to enterprise, but I think there's definitely pockets of consideration.
And I think one interesting piece here is the woman was in Vienna who downloaded this stuff and archived it, but this was primarily a platform, or the content was being used by a lot of people in the US. And so then we start looking at this whole concept of, well, what does it mean if I do have data that's might fall under different regulations and different regulatory requirements, and that's being hosted, like you said, by a third party. So we add to that the international laws and the international regulations.
Yep. And you know, the last kind of semi-interesting point as I watch this unfold is that this treasure trove of data from Parler was 70 terabytes. That's not that much data. I mean, if you think about it in the scheme of an enterprise, that's a rounding error. So that's another, I think, really important consideration, which kind of connects back to the topic we talked about off the top, which is if you have to apply your absolute, you know, super platinum level of protection and performance and resilience to a data set that's only 70 terabytes in size, that's pretty manageable. I mean, that's not going to cost you $1 bazillion, right? So if you focus and classify correctly, the point is you can get a lot of bang for your buck if you don't, you know, apply your tier 0 protection scheme and SLA to, you know, your 50 petabytes of ancillary data. So.
And I think this could also be a topic for next week about what does it mean when you have data on a third-party cloud? How do you protect that? How do you do disaster recovery? What do you plan for? This is a whole new way of thinking about, gee, what happens to that data out there?
I mean, they did. I haven't been following this as closely, and I wasn't the Parler user, but they are back up, right? So AWS's deplatforming of them, obviously they had some sort of data resilience because they got their data back, I think.
Well, they kind of did. I mean, they were down.
Okay.
I didn't know they were back up. I'm not a user either, but they were down for a pretty significant period of time because, you know, given the events that led up to the deplatforming, their DR plan was, well, we'll just go find another provider. And all the other providers are like, no, no, thanks. I'm not interested. So then they were forced with having to spin up their own data center. So they had to go invest in a bunch of equipment and get some rack space and run it themselves. So they sort of missed out on all the economies of scale and theoretical benefits of going into the public cloud. So there's just so many fascinating angles to the story, I think. So even if you take the whole political, social, cultural, ethical questions out of it, it's just a very interesting case study in how, a service provider relationship in both directions can go awry. So anyway.
Randy, I want to thank you for bringing that's a great data story. You're right. Take any of the First Amendment rights out. Take out whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
The data story about where you build, what you protect, how to be able to get back. All of that is kind of core to kind of some of the things that we talk about. So, team, I want to thank you all very much for our first episode here in 2021. We're going to get better and better as we go along here. Again, you want to send us any notes about topics that are interesting to you. We talked about all the different social media platforms where you can find us. We'd be happy to talk about topics that you'd like us to talk about. So with that, I'll say thank you all very much and have a wonderful day.